Atchison, Missouri, and Western, was born in the little Ozark town of Chadwick, Missouri, a small settlement with big ambitions. Our first rails wound through the hills carrying the promise of progress. The roster began with just two engines. Betsy, a sturdy Class B 8-ton Porter 040, worked the Chadwick yard, shuffling cars and building trains. And Navajo, a Baldwin 8.5 C3 240, took those trains beyond town, out to the industries that kept the region alive, from delivering logs to the sawmill to seed pallets and water to the wheat farm. But the AM&W was always looking ahead. The smelter's furnaces were hungry for cordwood, and that meant pushing the rails further into rugged country. Soon, new track would leave Chadwick, opening the next chapter in our story. Beyond Chadwick, the land was wild, steep hillsides cloaked in pine and oak. The survey crew traced a path along the mountain's left flank, easing the grade to just 2% to keep the climb steady. Then came the most daunting challenge yet, a vast valley, wide and unforgiving. Crossing it would take more than track and ties, it would take grit. Timber was cut, pilings driven, and span by span the bridge began to rise. Day after day the crew battled the elements and the sheer drop below. And at last, with the final spike driven and the last rail laid, the AM&W had a lifeline to the smelter. So the crew pressed on, continuing the route, hoping to reach the valley floor by the end of summer. As the last rails closed the gap to the smelter, one thing became clear. The Atchison, Missouri and Western needed more muscle. Cordwood trains would be long, heavy, and unrelenting, and Navajo couldn't shoulder the burden alone. The answer came in the form of a Baldwin 818D2, a sturdy 260 mogul. She was christened Firefly, a name that suited her bright headlamp and quick, sure stride. With the firebox roaring and the boiler brimming with steam, Firefly eased onto the main, bound for the smelter's hungry furnaces. As Firefly eases across the final stretch and the smelter comes into view, the journey from Chadwick to here feels like a triumph. From the first logs to the sawmill, to the seed runs across the prairie, to bridging the valley and bringing cordwood to the furnaces. The Atchison, Missouri and Western has come a long way in just one episode. I want to thank you for riding along on this first adventure in the AM&W Railroad Online series. I hope you've enjoyed the sights, the sounds, and the story of our little line's big beginnings. If you did, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next run down the rails. This is Frisco Man 1522 signing off.